Protecting land for the environment is easy to understand. Animals and plants need to be protected from development in order to have habitat. But how is land acquired, protected, and the ways that it's maintained? These are much more complex ideas. And the ways that conservationists work to ensure that habitat are protected and will exist into perpetuity, that's quite varied. On today's show, we're diving into how conservation works, and we're talking with someone who's made it their career. We'll discuss how protecting our natural areas benefits everyone, upstream and downstream, regardless of if they ever step foot into conservation spaces, and the new ways that conservationists and developers can work together to make our environment safer for us all. I'm Weston Twardowski, the Associate Director of Rice's Center for Environmental Studies and Associate Director of Eco Studio in the Rice Sustainability Institute, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Today we're sitting down with Mary Anne Piacentini, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Coastal Prairie Conservancy and has been doing conservation work in and around Houston for almost 25 years. Mary Anne, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
I am delighted to get to talk with you a little bit, and there's so many things we can jump into when we think of the Coastal Prairie Conservancy, but actually we were just talking before we started recording a little bit about your background, and I think that's a great place to begin because you were telling me that you were actually an urban planner before you moved into conservation work.
I am. I'm an urban planner who unfortunately moved to Texas, and there aren't a lot of urban planning jobs. I actually started out, I didn't tell you this when we were talking earlier, with the Houston-Galveston Area Council of Governments, and I was working on their housing program for Section 8. And I don't know if you can imagine this, but rural communities weren't really thrilled about having Section 8 housing, which is low-income housing, essentially low and moderate-income housing. And so after about 5 months, the mayor's office called me and said, "We saw your resume," because I had applied to them too, but they hadn't offered me anything. "And we'd like you to come in and have an interview." And so they did, and I talked to my boss at HGAC, and he said, "It's a good opportunity for you." And I said, "Fantastic." And I said, "You don't mind?" And he said, "No." So I worked for the mayor's office for community development, which again was low and moderate income program, community program, but it was wonderful because I got to be their senior policy planner, and I did parks, I did arts, I did streets, and I did not do housing, interestingly enough. But what was great was I got to meet all of the city departments because when we first started, what we were doing is even though we were coming up with master plans for those communities, then there were 23 of them at the time, we would try to also say, look, you're already doing this nearby. Could you do this? Could you help us figure out this? Because they'd been doing streets and roads. They'd been doing park development. And it worked really well. And I was able to get them to do a lot of stuff that was very helpful, but also was in their wheelhouse, not ours. It ended up that they didn't keep doing that. They started doing a lot of the work themselves. And so I left after 3 years and went to the Arts Council, which is now the Houston Arts Alliance. And I was the assistant director for 2 years, and then I was the director for 10 years. And so I worked a lot with the major institutions. We tried to put in individual artist program. I didn't succeed, but my successor did, and she was a colleague and a friend, so it was really great that happened. And then I went to Massachusetts and ran the Massachusetts Cultural Council just for a couple years, and then came back and did Friends of Herman Park. And in between Massachusetts and Friends of Herman Park, I actually wrote a plan for a foundation for Texas Parks and Wildlife, which has then since morphed into the Texas Parks and Wildlife Foundation. And it was an attempt to make sure that there was private funding that was available for the state because the state couldn't actually afford all of the kind of the bells and whistles and the frills. And so it made me realize that there were a lot of land trusts out there, which I hadn't really been aware of. And so I started researching land trusts, and I thought, this is what I want to do. But I thought we'd have to move again because I didn't really understand that there were a lot of land trusts around here. And because I'd always had a consulting business doing strategic plans and fundraising and looking for staffing, I hooked up with the Coastal Prairie Conservancy, our former name. And we talked, and I kept telling them, this is what you're looking for, this is what you should do, this is blah, blah, blah. And they liked me and kept saying, well, why don't you do it? And I kind of said, well, I'm not a biologist, I'm not a botanist. I said, I mean, I like to be outdoors, but I can identify 10 birds, and then they have to be the way they look in the book. So I said, I don't think I'm the right person for you. And they said, well, what would make it worth it, or make it worthwhile for us and make it worthwhile for you? And I said, well, how about if we get an expert in some of those areas? And so I found a fantastic person. This was in 1999. We offered him the job, and he said no. And I went, oh my gosh, none of the other candidates were really wonderful. And after 8 months, he came back to me, and he'd been really gracious. He'd sent a wonderful little note. He'd actually contributed to the Conservancy because we're a nonprofit 501c3 organization, and we do depend on donations. He sent in a gift, and then a friend of his said something about, you're not happy where you are. Why don't you go back to the Conservancy? And he said, oh, by now they've hired. He said, I know they have. And the person knew me, too, and they said, Mary Anne hasn't found anybody that she really likes. So he called me back, and I said, the job is yours. And we've been together for 25 years. I, call him my work husband because truly, I've been married longer than that. My kids are older than that, but Wesley and I have certainly got a long relationship. And the thing that's interesting about it is, even though I'm an urban planner, I knew a lot about rural development. I knew a lot about actually land deals. I knew a lot about the need to save land for wildlife habitat, for recreation, for air and water quality, for all those things. So it was fortunate that I was able to do all that. And I probably shouldn't say this on the radio, but I also knew a fair amount. I'd gotten into law school, didn't go, but got in because we moved to Massachusetts instead. And I was able to read contracts, read land deals.
It's a useful skill in life.
It was a useful skill. And the thing that was interesting about it is I always had a lawyer who we hired as an outside consultant, but he didn't always look at it from the land trust perspective. So I was able to look at it and to say, well, that's great for the landowner, and I want to have a good deal for the landowner, but I also want a good deal for the land trust. So could we tweak this here, and could we tweak this there? And it's kind of like acting like one of my colleagues said is, what's he call it? Sidearm lawyers. And we got to be careful because, it's not legal. So that's why I always, and then I hired lawyers on staff. So we've had two. One is now a city attorney in Austin, and the other is still with us. She's been with us for 8 years, and she's our vice president and general counsel. And it is fabulous having a real honest-to-goodness attorney because they can read the contracts, they can read the fine print, they can understand why you might think about doing something one way versus another way. So keeps all of us honest.
What I love about, the story of how you kind of got to running the Conservancy and the various folks that you're highlighting along the way is that it shows, I think when folks think of, especially environmental careers, right, they probably jump to naturalist, biologist, that it's this very kind of linear path, maybe sustainability expert. And I mean, I have an arts background as well. I was excited to hear you have an arts background. Yeah. And these are things that absolutely go together, that kind of, the way we think about culture, recreation, tourism, the way that we think about the way our cities are designed. And actually on last week's episode, and I'd encourage listeners to go back if they missed it to give it a listen, was entirely about development and floodplains around the area. And
we deal with flooding a lot.
Exactly. And I mean, if we're thinking about the urban ramifications of conservation, those things are glued at the hip. So to me, it makes total sense that you have an urban planning background, that you have experience working in government before moving into this space. But I do think it's something that probably surprises folks, that oftentimes that feels like a very non-linear path to folks. And it's one of those things when you've lived it and kind of wound up there, you're like, well, actually, it makes total sense.
It does. It's actually been extraordinarily helpful because I've been on planning boards. I've been on flood control groups. I'm the vice chair of the Harris County Community Flood Resilience Task Force group. I've been the alternate, although Lisa is my VP, is the formal person on it. I'm also on the San Jacinto Regional Flood Planning Group, Region 6. And it's made a huge difference because I can see that. I can see what rural issues are, but what urban issues, and how some of those rural issues, as they change, are really affecting urban areas, and the same back. And I also will tell you that when I hire somebody, I often actually really look for generalists, people who have a broader background, because they tend to have amazing critical thinking skills. They're often well-read, and not just, reading Aldo Leopold, but reading. And it's interesting. I ask this funny little question at the end of every interview, and I always know when they're doing it because they think they know what I'm looking for. And I ask them, if you could have dinner with 3 people, dead or alive, and separately or together, who would you choose? And it's really interesting because almost all of my people are politicians. Those are the ones that I would want, unless I'm being really goofy, and then it's Colin Firth and people like that. But mostly,
See, I'm Gilda Radner and Gene Wilder.
Fantastic people. I quote Gilda Radner all the time. She was
How can you not?
She was just
brilliant.
the best.
The two of them at dinner.
And that would be fantastic. Well, mine are Thomas Jefferson, Franklin Roosevelt, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Harry Truman. And I think I'd actually get Roosevelt and Truman together, because I think that Roosevelt really didn't always understand how brilliant Harry S. Truman was, and that he would see what he was able to do, even though it was just one term. He was still, I think, pretty amazing, and loved one of his biographies. I'm sure he has more than one, but the one that I read was really, really good. But it's interesting because they'll say, Leopold, Aldo Leopold, and then they'll say
Rachel Carson.
Rachel Carson, and then Jane Goodall. And I'll sit there and go, okay, they think that they're playing right into me, and they're not. And then the other interesting thing is that I'm always interested when they come up with really wild things. Like one person was really into music, and he told me that he liked to meet Elvis, and then he wanted Eric Clapton, and then the last person was not one of those people, a musician. But it was really interesting because it made me think, okay, who would I want, if I were doing that? So it's always interesting. And usually we do some of these interviews with our staff, and then they start to go, oh, who would I say? And they love it. And it's a question that it's also interesting to see how easily a person can morph into what they think they're going to get in the interview to what we then throw at them, and how quick can they, bounce back? Are they able to really process it and deal with it in a way that I know then that they're going to be a kind of quick study?
Yeah.
And it helps.
So tell us a little bit. The Coastal Prairie Conservancy, which, as you mentioned, was formerly the Katy Prairie Conservancy. Tell us a little, just the quick version of the history, but really, what is the Conservancy's mission? What is it that you guys do to help protect our coastal prairie?
Well, we were started in 1992, actually by a bunch of people who were considered themselves conservationists, but also hunters, fishermen, and they were really concerned about the loss of wetlands on Houston's west side. It had been huge rice farming. It had over 70,000 acres of rice farms in its heyday. And those rice farms nurtured a lot of migratory waterfowl, especially snow geese. And people used to talk about the fact that when you would be driving out west, you would see these black plumes. And it was like there was a fire, but instead it was the tips of the wings of the snow geese in formation. And they said it was just phenomenal. And they were worried that we were losing it. So they started it, and they started it as a nonprofit land trust. It was called the Katy Prairie Land Trust when it started, and quickly morphed into the Katy Prairie Conservancy. And the goal was really to save prairies, wetlands, and agricultural lands. And that's still our mission. But we plugged along, and we were saving land. We own now about 13,500 acres, and we pay taxes on all the acres. We take care of the acres. We do lease it out for farming and ranching, so we still have the only, we think, that we know of, the only rice farm in Harris County.
Oh, wow.
And then we have some rice farming in Waller, and there's more than just ours. So that's really exciting. And then we have cattle. We tried to do a regenerative cattle program, and we still do that, where they, move them from pasture to pasture and from paddock to paddock. But in 2014, we decided we really needed to do a strategic plan because not enough people knew about us. We had great supporters, but mostly from Houston, not a lot from Katy, not a lot from the bigger environs, and we wanted to see what was the deal, why. And one of the things we found out is that a lot of what we were doing was good, although some of it was geared toward kids who we want kids to become conservationists, environmentalists, good citizens, but 5-year-olds don't really vote yet, and they don't they don't support nonprofits, and how to get their parents involved, but also just to see that we weren't as small as it looked when we were called the Coastal Prairie Conservancy, because people would think, oh, you're just working in Katy. What are you doing? And we were actually in western Harris County and eastern Waller County, and then I'll tell you, and in Fort Bend, and I'll tell you about the other counties in a minute. So in 2014, we had what we were called listening tours, and we just went out and we talked to people, and we said, what do you know about us? And we handpicked the people, but not because we wanted everybody to know about us. It was because we wanted people who didn't know about us as well. And we found it was very surprising. They didn't always know what we did. They thought we did good work, but they didn't know what we did. They knew we liked birds, but they didn't know about all the other things. And they knew that we were saving prairie, but there wasn't a heck of a lot of prairie left. So why were we doing that? And they didn't realize our geographic focus. And so in 2017, after the 3-year strategy program was done, our board realized that we had an opportunity to go beyond the historic Katy Prairie. And so we set up some criteria for how would we do that. And we would do it if it was a donated conservation easement. And for your listeners, a conservation easement is basically a legal agreement, it's voluntary, between a landowner and a qualified entity like a land trust, a municipality, entity of government, that protects the conservation values of that land in perpetuity. So that's forever, and we often say forever is a long time, as you know. And it binds the land, not the landowner. So if the landowner wants to sell his or her land, they can, but that conservation easement, those guidelines, those requirements go with it. And so we've got our first one in Matagorda County of a 5,300-acre ranch, and it was all donated, and it was fantastic. And all of a sudden, my board saw not only that we could go farther afield, but that also that foundations suddenly that hadn't been available to us or accessible to us were interested in helping us do that. So in 2017, we did that. By 2022, we had certainly not more land outside of the Katy Prairie than we had inside, but still it was really getting up there. Now we're at 14,000 outside the Katy Prairie and almost 20,000 inside on the Katy Prairie. And we thought, shouldn't we really change our name? We're bigger than we sound. We're bigger than we look. And so we did pretty exhaustive search, talked to a lot of people, and we announced it at our 2022 gala. And everybody gasped, but then everybody clapped, and they loved it. And we did it so that it was announced everywhere else at the same time that we announced it at the gala. So it was pretty exciting. So the world learned about it. And I will tell you that I got hundreds of emails saying, this is so wonderful. I'm so glad you did it. I got one that didn't like it. But when they understood that we weren't giving up on the historic Katy Prairie, we were going to continue to save land there, but we did need to grow. We did need to be bigger, better. They began to understand that it was okay, and we haven't given up on the Katy Prairie. Right now we're finishing up the protection of a 442-acre property that's does some rice farming. The guy is crazy for waterfowl, especially ducks. And so he does a lot of wetland work, and he does a lot of farming that actually supports the wetland species. And so it's great. We won't own it. We'll have a conservation easement on it. And so that's a lot smaller than, say, the 2,500 acres we're working in Brazoria right now to save a property there that was in farming. It's coastal prairie. It's bottomland hardwood. It's really cool stuff. But the scale is different. So the work that we're doing on the Katy Prairie is expensive. The project that we're working right now, the easement for the 442 acres, which is about 60% of the value of the land, is now it's actually up to $16 million. We're paying $9 million. We've secured the funding for that, and the landowners are donating it as a bargain sale. They could have donated it at all, but a lot of people can't afford to do that anymore. So if we can, we work with landowners who are willing to donate the value of their conservation easement, and then they get a tax deduction for up to 16 years based on 50% of their adjusted gross income, or 100% if they make more than the majority of their money from farming. And if they want money, then we work with groups like the North American Wetlands Conservation Act Standard Grant Program, which is a fish and wildlife program, or with Natural Resources Conservation Service with their farm bill. And we try to raise the money for them because we know that land is someone's greatest asset. And if they can't afford to donate it, it might be their retirement. And one of the things that's interesting about this is that we always tell them, listen, talk to your family about this. Don't do this by yourself, because it's important that your family understand why you're doing it. But it's also important that your family understands that not only will they be able to sell it in the future, and the easement will go with it, so those same restrictions will go with it. It often appreciates in value over time, even with a conservation easement on it. And sometimes, especially because of conservation easement on it, because people go, wow, I don't have to have 2,500 neighbors next to me. I am on this 500-acre plot. I have one building in the middle of it, maybe two. I don't ever want to subdivide it. And my family can enjoy it. And guess what? I'm an hour from downtown Houston, or I'm 2 hours from downtown Houston. It's pretty exciting. And while I don't think any of our properties have yet turned over to another landowner, we know that does happen all over the United States. And in places like the East Coast and the West Coast, their easements are much older than ours. And so there's been that turnover. And the trick is, or the thing to do, is to make sure that the land trust is in close communication with the landowner, so that when the landowner decides to sell, even though it's a requirement that they inform us, sometimes landowners don't remember everything, or it's their kids that are doing it, and the kids haven't read the easement. We try to make sure that we keep up with it, and also there's a trigger because it's recorded with the deed. Then we get information from, say, Harris County Appraisal District or from Waller County Appraisal District. And then we can go to the landowner and say, listen, we understand you want to sell your land. That's perfectly fine, but we want the landowner to know what the restrictions are. And most of the time, because they care about it and they want to do it, they are fine. Sometimes we've had, occasionally minor problems, and we've worked out those problems with the landowner. And in most cases, it's because they just don't understand that, oh, I didn't realize that was a restriction. And there are lots of things they can do. They can continue to farm it. They can continue to hunt it. They can continue to lease it for hunting and farming. They can't set up a commercial venture. They can't have commercial ATVs running all over the place. But they could have a horse barn and have people come in and, ride horses if they want to and charge for it. They also are, we encourage them to do some things that also improve the value of their land. So if we see that they're getting overrun with invasive species like McCartney rose or Chinese tallow, we do say, listen, there are programs and there are funds that you can go after. And sometimes they don't know that. And they go, wow, well, I've been meaning to get to that, but we can help them. And that's the case that we have a program that we work on with the Natural Resources Conservation Service that's under their Regional Conservation Partnership Program. And much of the money is used for conservation easements to pay 50% of the easement. But some of the money is used for habitat management and enhancement. And we have a group, Wildlife Habitat Federation, affectionately known as WHF, and they are great about putting together free management plans, helping the landowners actually go after funding for the implementation of that. And it's been great because then the landowner begins to say, hey, this is pretty cool. And they also begin to say, maybe it's good to work with the Coastal Prairie Conservancy, because the last thing we want, or I guess the thing we want the most, is we want to make this as good a deal for the landowner as it is for the land trust. Because that landowner is going to talk to his neighbors, and he's going to tell his friends, and he's going to say, you know what? A, you ought to think about this because this is a good deal. But B, guess what? I worked with this fantastic organization, and whenever we had a bump in the road, we worked it out, we compromised, we figured it out. Sometimes I was the lead on it, sometimes they were the lead on it, and it's really been a pretty wonderful situation. And I think all of our staff members could say with great pride that when we walk away from a project, we know that it's a good project and that the landowner feels good about it as well.
I think this is really fascinating because I think for a lot of folks, when they imagine a conservancy, they're just kind of visualizing a group that they go out and they buy a bunch of land and then they just protect it, whatever that means, which often I think folks also just think means kind of letting it sit there. And I think what you're getting at is both, one, this is a much more deeply legally complex and difficult, not in a negative sense, but just people are involved and generational thinking is involved. That's very complex kind of work to protect these areas when you still have folks who are on that land. But it also points to, as you're mentioning, a lot of maintenance and a lot of ongoing work in trying to protect that land. And I think it's easy to have a kind of idea of nature will just do what nature's supposed to and what it wants to.
Not in such southern climes as this. If you're in the Prairie Pothole area
that?
up in the North Dakota, it's Prairie Pothole area in North Dakota, they have winter. And so a lot of the invasive species actually die back.
Yeah.
We don't have that. I mean, we have a 10-month growing season. Sometimes it's 12 months. It just seems like it's forever. So our invasive species have to be maintained and managed. And I used to say that they would be eliminated. And my conservation director, whom I told you about earlier, said, we will never eliminate them. We will reduce them. We will manage them. We will make sure that they don't take over. And we'll get them down to maybe 5% of the land cover. But we'll never eliminate them. And so we do work on that. And unfortunately for us here, there are a lot of different things that are problems. Deep-rooted sedge, McCartney rose, the Chinese tallow I told you about. There's some other properties when you're farther west that are problematic, and there are different things that you need to take care of them. But one of the things I also want to say is that we've been very fortunate that a lot of corporations really like to do restoration, give money for restoration. So we spend $400,000 or $500,000 a year to work on our properties, and our goal is to get each property to the point where it is good enough that it can actually be maintained with modest input and a lot of volunteer support. And we're really lucky that we've got volunteers who like doing this. I also want to note, though, it's really critical that these lands aren't reserves. They're not ones that you can never go on.
Yeah.
We have public access on a number of areas. We've got about 6 trails right now. We're working on 2 more right now, and eventually a whole trail system along Cypress Creek, we hope. We have our Indian Grass Preserve that right now is open only 3 days a week from 9 to 1 on Tuesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. But we've actually polled all the people who use our facilities and a broader public and said, what would encourage you to come out here more? And they want a lot of, early evening events. They want a lot of early morning events, because that's when, if you're a bird watcher, it's really great to be able to see the birds at that time. But also because, a lot of people have other activities. And so if they could come out at 5 in the morning, which people go, whoa, who will do that? But they do. They can be home by 8 o'clock and they can take their kids to soccer practice or to baseball or to whatever. We also have a program where we actually introduce young people to hunting. And we have guides so that they're protected. We have gun safety programs. They come with a guardian or a parent. parent. And then the guides are there because many times the guardian or the parent doesn't have really any background in hunting. They don't know about it, but they know their kid wants it. And we did a program with Texas Parks and Wildlife with their television program. And it was so great because this woman was in waders, up to her chest, and she was in water behind some reeds, and she was talking about how her 13-year-old had asked her to do this, and she said sure, and she said, when is it? And he said, it's 5 o'clock, and she said, sure, no problem, we can do that. She said, little did I know that it was 5 a.m. in the morning. I thought this was cocktail hour. She said, but we went, and she said, how many times do you have a 13-year-old boy tell his mom, this was the best thing I ever did, can we do it again? I loved being with you. I loved doing it. He didn't have a dad who was present in his life, and his mom had to do everything. And it was so wonderful, and it was so great to capture it on camera. But truthfully, we have stories like that every weekend that we do this, and we do it, every year, and we get 15 to 20 kids. They stay over. They're babied. We cook for them. We make sure that they understand what they're doing. They get to go skeet shooting at the West Side shooting grounds, and they learn how to handle guns. But they learn about safety, and they learn about how to use guns appropriately, not inappropriately. And it's pretty terrific program. And we do it with Texas Wildlife Association. It's their youth hunting program.
I think that's something that, it's something we've mentioned in the past on the program, but it's something that often isn't where folks' mind first goes when they think of conservation. But hunting, fishing, wildlife, and conservation have been glued at the hip basically since the invention of conservation in this country.
Exactly. Since the early teens, I think.
And it's been a major funding.
Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt. The duck stamps.
Yeah.
Migratory duck stamps, both for the state and for the feds, have an amazing impact on conservation, on the Land and Water Conservation Fund, all kinds of things. And what's amazing about it is that hunters are truly conservationists. If they don't...
hunting and fishing licenses directly go to conservation dollars.
Exactly.
And that's where I was heading was, it's one of the things that as hunting has been less popular in recent years, we've actually seen large crises at the federal level around conservation dollars. Oh. And so, I'd love for you to talk just a little more about, that interplay and relationship, because I think it's something people don't jump to or even know about.
Exactly. One of the things we always try to do when we're giving talks is to talk about the hunting license and the fishing license, because people don't think about going out and buying one if they're not a hunter or a fisher person. And so we say, buy one if you care about conservation. Sure, we'd love you to give us money, give us donations. That's great. But when you do that, you're keeping it alive. Or buy, get your duck stamp. Do this because it's really important, because it keeps things going. And, encourage your Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts to at least learn about getting their hunting badge or their fishing badge, and then maybe they'll grow up to do that. And it's true. Every time you hear from Texas Parks and Wildlife, they're saying, even if you're not ever going to use that license, go ahead and buy it, because what you're doing is you're supporting the work that we're doing to make these lands open for everybody. And sure, there are wildlife management areas, but those wildlife management areas aren't just for hunters or fisher people. They're for the regular person that comes out for a hike or just to watch birds or just comes out because they're tired of living next to a freeway or listening to tons of traffic or sirens, and they just want to decompress. They want to come out. And when we used to have a lot of tours, and I don't do as many of the tours anymore because we have wonderful docents who are biologists and botanists and master naturalists, we would always say, okay, let's take a minute and let's not say anything. Let's not talk. And they do that. And then I said, and then just listen. And so they do. And then I say, okay, what did you hear? And the first thing that comes out of every little kid is, well, I didn't hear any cars. And somebody else would say, I didn't hear any noise. And then you'll start to hear them say, I think I heard, was that a frog? And somebody else will say, I heard a bird chirp. And they suddenly realize that there are so many sounds, that it's a cacophony of sounds. If you think about it, it's wonderful. But you don't necessarily think about that when you're in your home. Like when I go out, and I'm not a very good gardener. I try. I have a lot of native plants in my yard, and I try, but I'm not really good at it. And thank goodness they kind of take care of themselves. But, I just hear the screech of squirrels, which is annoying. Baby squirrels wanting their, want their little food. But then we had mockingbird nests in our live oaks, and they were really wonderful because they will mimic anything that you do. So I would whistle, and they would sound like they were whistling back. I mean, it was fantastic. But if you don't do that, if you don't pay attention, and that's one of the things that when we have a lot of kids come out, we don't fill them up with 1,000 activities. We actually don't even say, oh, you have to memorize this, you have to memorize that. What we say is, what are the kinds of things that you're seeing? And if they say that I see a black and white bird with, pink legs, we don't immediately say, oh, that's a black-necked stilt. We say, what does it remind you of? And sometimes if they've seen a program like this, or they have parents who go to galas and things, they say, it looks like it has a tuxedo on. And I said, you're right. And, and it has those funny pink legs. And so we'll talk about it, and they'll remember that. They come back and they might not remember it's a black-necked stilt, but they'll remember about the tuxedo. They'll remember that, how it goes into our wetlands, the shallow waters and things, and they'll remember it. And then we have roseate spoonbills, and they're pink and white, and people just go, whoa, what are those? And they're huge. And I have a funny story. We still have a lot of bald eagles on the Katy Prairie.
I don't think many people know that. I don't think folks are thinking of the Houston area and, kind of southeast Texas, and bald eagles are springing to mind.
We do. In fact, we had 2 nests immediately adjacent to us, one on our landowner's property and one near our Warren Ranch, right at the edge of our Warren Ranch, which I told you earlier that we own a ranch that's a large cattle ranch. It's so amazing because one time I was driving for a meeting, and this was now in like 2003 or 2004 when there were still lots of geese. And the geese I had to stop to take a phone call. And it was at a time when I didn't have a picture phone. I just had a regular flip phone. And so I was watching the geese go back and forth, and I said, what the heck is making those geese crazy? Why are they? I mean, they're clearly concerned that they're troubled. And so I looked back and forth. I didn't notice anything. And then all of a sudden I thought, I really have got to get to this meeting. I've got 10 people and I'm not going to have them wait for me. So I started to drive my car very slowly. And as I looked to the left, what should I see but a bald eagle on the fence post that was literally from you to me. So that's what, maybe 10 feet, 8 feet? It was phenomenal. And I thought, oh my gosh, why don't I have a camera? Because it was just staring at me. And I finally said, I wrote, it was when we still had a print newsletter, and I said in my newsletter, in the story that I was writing, I said, now I really know what it means to give someone the eagle eye. But we do have a lot. We have 16 to 30 that migrate. And what's really amazing is, and a lot of people don't know this, but bald eagles mate for life. And it's the male eagle that actually builds the nest. And these nests are huge. They're like 6 feet tall. And they do this as a way to attract the female. And so they put a lot of care into these. I mean, these look like extraordinarily beautiful woven baskets. They're so gorgeous. And so, the landowner that has it is always amazed because they come back every year. Yeah. And then the other ones, we're not always sure where they are. But one year we were having a program on eagles, and Jaime Gonzalez, who
has been on the show multiple times.
Yes,
Great conservationist.
And he's
in
wonderful,
town.
And he's now with the the Institute for Ecological
Resilience,
thank you. But he was with us for 12 years and was fabulous. He was our community conservation director. And he was doing this program, and he said, now look, you're probably not going to see an eagle. I'm going to show you a lot of pictures, but we're probably not going to see an eagle. So the little boy goes out before everybody. He runs back in. He said, there are 2 eagles on the utility poles. And sure enough, they were, and they stayed there. And people went, Jaime, did you plan this? And it was so perfect because it would be something Jaime would plan if he could do it.
Absolutely, yes. We'll have to give him let him know he got a shot out.
Yeah. So I hope, Weston, that people do know they can come out to our programs. For the vast majority of them, like if you come out when it's open days, on Saturdays, Tuesdays, or Fridays. It's free. We have modest costs sometimes when we're doing a program that has supplies and materials. We also love people to come out and volunteer for us if they want to come out to Stewardship Saturdays, which are the second Saturdays every month, and they get to get dirty and pull weeds and actually plant things. We have our own nursery in which we do thousands of plants every year. In fact, we are finishing up a milkweed project with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation in which we agreed to grow out and plant 20,000 milkweeds.
Wow.
And we're now down to having only 3,000 left, and we have enough time because we have till March. We also are doing buffer strips as well of milkweed because the native milkweed is declining, and that is the primary food for, I think it's the only food for monarch butterflies. So we want to make sure that the native monarchs come back and that they aren't totally decimated. So that's one of the things we're doing. But the nursery also helps us to plant our prairies because, as you probably know, but maybe all of your readers don't know, there are maybe 4 to 5% of the prairies left in this region, only 1% in pristine shape, and maybe 15 to 20% in restorable shape. So one of the things we're doing, and we do have our Williams Prairie, which is over near Fulshire, that actually is a remnant prairie, and it's gorgeous. But the other prairies we have, we're trying to recreate nature, and we again talked about this earlier. Nature is hard to recreate. If you can preserve it, if you can maintain it and keep it, do it. Because as this 4th century BC, no, he wasn't a philosopher. He was it was Juvenal. I can't remember what it was. He was like a jokester almost. But he said, never does nature say one thing and wisdom another. And he's right. We need to preserve our floodplains, our floodways, and use them appropriately and not.
That's a little what I wanted to close on here. As you've mentioned, a great deal about wildlife in particular. And we've talked about, of course, the importance of native plants. And we've talked on the program a great deal about the various ways that, these ideas of biodiversity are really significant for resilience. But I think especially, as I mentioned earlier, last week we were talking about development specifically in floodplains, and that it is really easy to go by a prairie, a grassland, and just think, well, it's a bunch of grass. We should build there. So can you talk a little about, the importance of, yes, preserving this, which, as we said, wildlife, all these other myriad reasons, enjoyment, but also from an infrastructural point of view, maybe going back a little bit to your urban planning side, there are all these downstream benefits. So can you share a little of that?
Of course. First of all, you're right that most people look at the prairie and think this is flat. Cheap. It's not cheap anymore, but it was cheap and it's easy to grow. What they don't realize is that prairies hold a lot of water. Yeah. They have oftentimes 2 times the length of their upper area plant material, upper vegetation underground.
I think what you're trying to say is like the roots are very, very long.
Exactly.
For these. Yeah. There's great pictures online where you see, like a 6-foot piece of grass or something that's, sticking out there, and then it has like 16 feet of grass underneath under the ground.
Some people would argue that we have a lot of clay soil, and so it's very hard to break through clay. On the Katy Prairie, it's sandy loam, so first of all, it's easier to get down. But there is a clay pan that's anywhere from 3 to 4 feet. But one of the things we find, and we're actually working with Bill Bedient and Larry Dunbar at the Speed Center on another study of infiltration, absorption, and something called interflow that I'm going to talk about. What happens is because we have periods of drought and periods of heavy rain, a lot of our clay is cracked. And so it's almost like what you have in Austin with the limestone, little holes in it. And so the roots that if you were in like even Oklahoma or you were in the Dakotas do go straight down. Ours tend to go down to a certain point and then they start going horizontally. They still hold a lot of water, but that water, they create little channels that then go into a canal or to a bayou or a stream or whatever. So we're finding that I'll say it this way because I don't think people care about the exact numbers, but it's the case that we looked at developed lands, we looked at pasture, we looked at even improved pasture, that were like Tifton and things like that. And then we looked at prairies and we looked at wetlands. And wetlands were able to detain about 1.3 acre feet of water. And that means every acre foot it's 1 foot deep on an acre is an acre foot. And wetlands actually hold 4 to 6 because they hold 2 underground and 2 above ground or more. But we were using this for if you were just looking at infiltration and detention. And then the prairie holds 1.2, so it's pretty good. Whereas a developed area holds maybe 0.5 and pasture maybe 0.8. So we're significantly better. During the tax day flood, which was a unique flood in the sense that a lot of rain in few hours, 24 inches in 12 hours.
Wow.
12 inches in 23 hours.
It was a heavy
It was
flood.
a heavy rain. Yes, thank you. I keep a lot of numbers and a lot of things in my head, but at that point I'm sitting there going, okay, which was it? It was a lot. Water didn't have anywhere to go. So we had our preserves were under 5 feet of water for 5 days. And what that meant is that water wasn't going downstream to damage anybody else because it didn't have anywhere to go. But it didn't hurt us. Our cows managed to get to high ground. They weren't bothered by it. Our infrastructure, we were lucky that most of it is on hills and we don't have a lot of buildings, so it was saved. Yes, we did. We lost some fences. We had a lot of trash, but it went down slowly. Now, with Hurricane Harvey, it was a different storm. Yeah. It was, over many days, and it kept raining. And so the bayous were able to fill up, release their water, and then fill up again and release their water. And then at a point where they couldn't do that anymore, of course, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers opened the gates. And they were worried that if it had kept raining, which is what the forecast said it was going to do, that basically they would blow out the gates and all of downtown Houston would be flooded with Memorial Park, Herman Park, the Memorial area, etc. Now, it's horrible for the people who were flooded. And, it's 10,000 homes and the people whose lives were lost. But it was all over. But the Cinco Ranch area where they lost so many houses, they were between, it appears to me that they felt like they didn't have any other option. And so they did it. I only wish, and what is it? Foresight is 20/20, hindsight is 20/20. You only wish that they'd made that decision, early afternoon, not at 1 or 2 in the morning when people were asleep. And unfortunately, it didn't. So it happened. But we can hold a lot of water, and we have studies that show that. And what's interesting is that we've been working with Houston Stronger, and they've done this Buffalo Bayou community plan, and it's just a concept, and it looks at things that are already being suggested by other people, like the tunnel that they're talking about doing from Addicks and Barker reservoirs all the way down to the ship channel. And is that a good idea? We studied it a little bit, but of course it's going to take a lot of other engineers. It was not the Conservancy that did it, but a group of people that were experts in this that looked at it and said, what do we think about it? We looked at excavating Addicks and Barker reservoirs so that they're deeper and could hold more water, but also so that we would get rid of some of the undergrowth that was there and make them back to being the ecological wonders that they were when they first took over and became Addicks and Barker reservoirs in 1943. And so, and then we looked at what could we do along creeks and bayous. And I think that if developers could understand that if they could save the floodways and the floodplains along those bayous and not develop in the floodplains, even though they, build up and they do all the things they're supposed to do, but they left the water flow, as they say in Denmark, make room for the water, make room for the river.
Living with water, yeah.
Living with water and living without water sometimes. But that it would be an amazing recreational resource. And so, you think that there could be a partnership between the public sector and the private sector to say, okay, we understand that you'll be giving up some money if you don't build in those areas because you can't put, 10 houses there or 100, who knows. But there are ways that we could save that land, use it as a wonderful recreational resource, and then the houses would still be near the water. They just wouldn't be in the water because Sam Brody will tell you, and he's with University, at Texas A&M at Galveston, in their disaster response program. And he says, if you're in the floodway, you're in the river. And it's true. You need to stay out of those areas. And more the floodplain gets, more and more bigger, and so it's a problem. So anyway, we think that we have a lot of things, but the best part about it is component 4 actually is looking at land preservation in the Cypress Creek watershed. The work we're doing, the work that other groups are doing to show that that land, when restored, will hold water. Will it eliminate flooding? No, it's never going to eliminate flooding. Will it reduce it? We think so. And we're doing the kinds of engineering work that will prove to the people who only like gray infrastructure that it can be done. But it'll also prove to people, younger engineers who love this kind of stuff, to say, yes, we can do this. And I'll give you a perfect example. I told you earlier I'm from New England, so I have a few New England stories. And in the 60s, there was a lot of concern about the Charles River flooding Boston and Cambridge, and they had to do something about it. And the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was going to build a dam, and it was going to cost $100 million. Well, a lot of people got together and said, we really don't want a dam that's going to cost $100 million, $1 million to operate every year, and then might cost more money to replace 20, 30 years from now. So we don't want that. Are there other opportunities? So engineers got together, conservation got together, scientists, environmentalists, et cetera, and they decided to purchase, I think, about a $10 million worth of wetlands upstream. And they left them. And then conservancies came around and they built trails and did all kinds of wonderful things. Well, the Charles River has never flooded Cambridge and Boston since, with the exception of Superstorm Sandy. And you know how devastating that was. Do you know what kind of storm it was for Boston and Cambridge? It was a 2-year flood. So it was like inches. And so it did its work. It's now the most wonderful wetland recreational resource, but it regenerates itself. If anything happens to it, it just comes back by itself. New York did it for drinking water. They did upstream. They bought 8,500 acres of wetlands for, again, about the same amount of money, about $10 million. And instead of doing a water treatment plant that was going to cost, again, about the same $100 million. And New York City, this is surprising for most people, has some of the best drinking water in the United States. It and Maine both have really great drinking water. And a lot of it is because they have areas that feed into it. Their headwaters are still rural, still clean, and they put in conservation easements, but they also put in conservation practices for those farmers and ranchers. So we do that. But also the last thing I'll say is that we also, absorb carbon. And so we help, sequester carbon, and we help clean the air and we clean the water. Wetlands are called nature's kidneys for a reason. It's because the water that goes into them, when it comes out, it's cleaner.
Yeah.
Now, is it pure? No, you can't drink it, but it filters out a lot of the pollutants. It might be for pesticides or your lawn care stuff. And so all of those things are important. So even if you never go out to the Katy Prairie and lay one foot on it, step on it once, you're benefiting from it. If you live downstream, if you live upstream, anywhere you live, you are going to benefit from it. And as we are able to buy more land in the 9 counties that we now work in Southeast Texas, other people are going to benefit from it. And I think our children and our grandchildren will benefit it. So I might be an urban planner, but I think I've become my own kind of conservationist and as well. And so my kids, when I said that I was taking this job, they go, "But Mom, why are you doing this? You're an urban planner. This isn't you." And I said, because I want to leave this for you guys.
What a perfect place to wrap our conversation today. Mary Anne Piacentini is the President and Chief Executive Officer at Coastal Prairie Conservancy. Real quick, if folks want to learn more about Coastal Prairie Conservancy, if they want to get involved, what's the best way for them to do so?
Best way is coastalprairieconservancy.org, and I know that's a long one, and it's awful, but you can do that there, and you'll learn about our nursery. You'll learn about volunteer opportunities. You'll also learn that we have the first certified green cemetery. And you'll learn about a natural burial system as well.
We'll have to hear about that from you
We'd
sometime
love to come
down
back
the road,
out again.
Yeah. Mary Anne, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Weston. I appreciate being here.
Now we'll go to our researcher, Numan, who has a new piece in her ongoing gardening series for us.
For today's gardening segment, I'm joined by Stephanie Gray, a County Extension Agent in Horticulture in Houston, Texas, working with the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. To start our conversation today, Stephanie begins with a discussion on bed preparation for lawns and why it's important.
So we're talking about turf grass establishment in Houston and bed preparations for your lawn. So there's different options for planting turf or grass in your lawn. So the first thing is considering what variety of grass you want to plant in your lawn. So there's a lot of research out there about what specific species and varieties of grass or turf does best in our area in Houston. So some popular grass species are like St. Augustine grass, azoysia grass, Bermuda grass, buffalo grass, and then we have some bluegrasses as well. But it depends on what variety of grass you're going to select. So I recommend going to our website, Aggie Turf. And there's a lot of information about, how shade tolerant certain species of grass are. So like anything, before you decide what to plant in your yard, you want to assess the site. So look at what areas of your lawn are covered in shade, what areas of your lawn are in the sun. Take into consideration the drainage of your soil. So do you have a really heavy clay soil, or are you more of a sandy type of soil? All of these will help you decide what kind of species you want to plant in your yard. From there, you'll be able to determine if you can direct seed or if you have to establish sod. And sod is just basically like a sheet of grass, like a little cut of grass. It's already sprouted. So you're basically transplanting that sod into your lawn, and then the roots will establish into the soil of your yard. So it's really important to do proper bed preparation before you lay down any sod. And a lot of this has to do with, again, making sure that you're tilling up your soil, reducing compaction, adding any type of nutrients to the soil that you might need to, and then watering in on a really regular schedule. So upon establishment, turf and sod really need to be watered about every other day for the first 2 or 3 weeks until those roots are established into the native ground. Apart from that, you can reduce your watering to about 1 inch every 7 days. And I'll mention again the Water My Yard website, because that's really great in helping you to establish turf as well. Make sure you're not overwatering it. In addition to establishing like a turf lawn, in those kind of hard to establish areas, which are maybe beneath a tree where there's not very much sun, where there's kind of root disturbances in the soil, we really recommend reaching for like an alternative ground cover. So this can be like a ruellia or a frog fruit. Kind of intermingling these native or adapted plants into a large stretch of lawn or turf will help to reduce the water inputs, and it'll help create more of like a resilient yard. So I would recommend that.
A big thanks to Stephanie for being a guest on the show. You can learn more about her and AgriLife Extension's horticulture program at harris.agrilife.org/hort. HORT. You can also learn more about Harris County Master Gardeners at txmg.org/HCMGA.
That's our show for this week. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westonT@rice.edu. A quick reminder, you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Original music by Carter Dean. Research support provided by Nemanja Rinsdorf and Sophia Soltesz. Stay tuned for No Expectations with Marcus French here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.